Welcome everyone to our 2021 State of Logistics webinar. We are excited to have you all here with us today to go through the highlights of the year with time for Q&A during the latter half of the webinar. Continuing on last year's theme of resilience tested as the industry navigated through unforeseen conditions, this year's story is one of adaptation. With that, I'm excited to introduce to you our panelists today, Balika Santelia and Michael Zimmerman. Balika has 14 years of experience in end-to-end supply chain management, spanning industries across consumer, retail, and industrials. She is a leader within Kearney's strategic operations practice, and she frequently speaks at major supply chain conferences and contributes to publications. Michael has 10 years of industry experience with over 20 in consulting. He is the leader of Kearney's logistics network sourcing and optimization capabilities, and he is constantly working with clients to solve complex logistics problems across modes, nodes, and geographies. As we transition to the presentation portion of the webinar, if you have any questions for our panelists, please use the Q&A feature located in the bottom right of your screen to share your questions, and be sure to send it to all panelists. With that, it's a time for a conversation with our panelists. I will now pass over to Michael, who will give a short introduction first and then speak to the major nodes. Over to you, Michael.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Lynn. And as you all know, this year's report title is Change of Plans. And I think it's almost an understatement to say that all of you on the call have had that experience and multiple times last year, and it's a continuing feature of the logistics market as we've gone beyond resilience tested to realize as logisticians that having better optionality, better carrier relationships, and a better feel for what's happening in the market has become even more critical today. Even as we speak, logistics rates are hovering near all-time highs. Capacity is at its almost most constrained in history, and the prognosis is tough out there. So we'll talk about this as we get into the modes, and I think the first thing we should do is look at the overview of U.S. business logistics costs across the modes. And what you'll see there is that the U.S. business logistics costs actually fell about 4% to 1.56 trillion, which is 7.4% of 2020's 21 trillion GDP. Most logisticians would be surprised by this drop, expecting a rise, but the shipping volume and price drops in the first half had a big impact, and more importantly, as we'll see in the detailed breakout here, the financial costs of inventories fell as interest rates were lowered, and the inventories to sales ratio hit 20-year lows in May of 2020 and kept falling. So the real story of dropping costs is around the costs of inventory, less expensive and less of it. And the transportation costs themselves actually rose. So if we look at some of the modes, the motor carriers fell 0.6%, volumes and rates fell early in the pandemic. And then inventory replenishment and supply chain restarts drove growth through the second half of 2020. And that's still happening now as we speak, with shippers anxious to secure capacity and get product for end of school and October, November, December, the holiday season. Parcel was up over 24%, driven by the surge of e-commerce. Rail was down about 11%, declining volumes, especially in carloads. But intermodal was less affected, and capacity is very tight in intermodal. Water transportation, which is international and domestic container traffic paid for by U.S. shippers plus domestic river moves, fell by 28%. Some of that was a change in methodology, but a drop in U.S. exports and U.S. domestic water traffic was to blame, as well as lower container prices in the first half. But as we've seen, they've surged in the second half and into 2021. And then on to inventory and financial costs. Those were down very substantially. So that's the lower half of the list you see there. That's really where costs came down substantially and drove that overall reduction in US business logistics costs. So let's take a look at the macroeconomic setting. The economy shrank by 3.5% as the pandemic upended both supply and demand. That is really what contributed to the decline in the logistics industry. But of course, this was in very volatile circumstances, which is part of what drove up the cost of logistics. So this 2020 upheaval of supply chains created chaos that placed gigantic demands on logistics, resulting in higher prices for logistics services, despite a shrinking economy. And then at the same time, due to halted economic activities during the lockdowns and decrease in financial costs and other costs, the logistics costs accounted for a lower percentage of GDP at 7.4%. It's still a very large part of our economy. So the forecast is for over 7% growth this year, and we're feeling it. But I think the biggest story behind macroeconomics, if we go to the next slide, Lynn, is around consumer confidence. And there was a wild ride there, right? Early in the pandemic, lockdowns and dire warnings led buyers and sellers to curb expenditures on all but the essentials. Then government stimulus and optimism put extra money in people's pockets, and there was premature celebration. And then there was disappointment when COVID surged back. Now, you can see that in the gyrations of confidence and expenditures growth in this graph. No surprise then that the producers and the supply chains and the logisticians serving this demand were having to change plans constantly. These conditions, as you know, are antithetical to what supply chains were optimized for, and the results were losses in efficiencies and underinvestment early in the pandemic and chaotic surges in demand against insufficient capacity later on. And we would make the case that we are all still very much living those conditions as we have echoes of COVID and a resurgence of COVID with the Delta variant and the uncertainty that that brings. Let's take a look at the motor carriers. So for the overall industry, the spread between spot rates and contracted rates had wild swings in 2021. It appeared to be stabilizing in 2021, but at very high rates. And in fact, we're still hovering at some of the highest rates that the market's ever seen, up 47% last week from last year, and near record spot rates. Despite industry efforts to bring more capacity into the market, it looks like it won't be enough to put serious downward pressure on rates in 2021. So don't expect a dramatic reversal anytime soon. We see rates hovering at a high rate through the end of the year. Ordered trucks still have to be manufactured. The drivers have to be trained and seated, and this takes time. And I was just looking at the ATA Class 8 truck orders. They're still at a very high rate, so the capacity is coming, but it takes a while to come online. Let's take a look at parcel and last mile. So hundreds of millions of people, practice social distancing and home isolation. So e-commerce became the lifeline, if you will, with last mile delivery to secure goods. The pandemic accelerated last mile growth, with shippers facing increasing pressures to adapt to the evolving landscape and meet rising consumer demands. That has dropped most recently, as UPS reported in their earnings, I think it was yesterday. People are starting to go back in stores, but expect the long-term growth of e-commerce to continue pressuring last mile capacity. So the parcel delivery section of U.S. business logistics costs grew 24%, $120 billion market, and that's a CAGR of 8.4%. Shippers yourselves are facing capacity challenges given this rapid evolution and expansion, but there are new entrants who are bringing capacity and capability into the marketplace. So we're optimistic that the optionality of shippers is going to be expanding, even if the short-term story has been one of tight capacity. Expect e-commerce to continue to keep growing from this high baseline. Let's have a look at water and ports. Rates were stable in the spring of 2020, then they ascended slowly in the summer and then steeply in the fall. They've remained at record high rates ever since. We show a 29% decline in the expenditure. That was due to some recalculations in the methodology, but also the drop in exports and the drop in water traffic and lower container prices in half one. High rates also had port congestion to thank in late 2020 and early 2021. And even as recently as 3 or 4 weeks ago, the port of Yantian was at 40% capacity. This creates the bullwhip effect in the ocean freight and drives rates upwards. Overextended and fragile networks awaited their shipments. Container shortages exacerbated high prices. We see ocean rates and some degree of disruption to continue. And that means that shippers need to explore alternative relationships with their carriers and have longer and deeper conversations about where capacity is going to come from and how to assure it. Let's take a look at warehousing, Lynn. It was a story of surging growth in warehousing in 2020. Despite the turbulence associated with COVID-19, warehousing growth remained strong in 2019, with many industry fundamentals up from a record-setting 2019. And we see that as continuing. E-commerce spurred continuing high demand for space, especially urban last-mile facilities, and reverse logistics supply chain capabilities from e-commerce sites added to demands for improved capabilities. And 3PLs and shippers are working on improving those capabilities. Clearly, providing visibility, efficiency, greater labor productivity, and the capacity to support resilience is top of mind for both providers and users of warehousing services. Last slide for me before I hand it over to Balika on trends in the industry. As you think of the variability that rocks supply chains and the logistics that support them, supply chain resilience and the ability to change plans has absolutely come to the fore. It was important before, but now it's a matter, frankly, of survival for companies and the logisticians that enable them. What you'll find in the report is detailed analysis on how shippers and carriers are working to better visibility and better agility in both their strategies and their technology adoption. We look into technology trends. We have a sustainability section that drives into the why and the how of this rising priority area for logisticians. You must build sustainability capabilities into your supply chains, and you will find, and we've seen this with our clients, that some of the sustainability targets that your company has can, in some cases, be easily achieved as part of your normal logistics improvement projects. So pay strong attention to that. You can bring tremendous benefit to your company's sustainability initiatives through logistics. So take a good look at the trends section, and then last point on right shoring and near shoring and offshoring. That topic has been very hot. We see firms paying increasing attention to what we would call right shoring, in the sense of what is the right balance and the right optionality on where their supply chains are going to be extending into, to provide them with more sources of supply and more abilities to respond to disruption in the supply chain. So with those words, I'll hand it over to Balika to look at some of the trends and results from surveys that we've seen. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I think on that point, let's pivot from the report to some trends we've been seeing on resiliency. So we started doing this last year. If you remember, for those of you who joined our report readout last year, we have weaved in the resilience theme and expanded on that, because the one thing COVID has taught us is just in time is no longer, the way to operate. Just in case is the way to operate. And for logistics, it is even more important, given that we're the last link to the customer, but the first I would say receiver of any impact that happens from a crisis perspective. So over the next few pages, I'm going to take you through an updated resilience report on end-to-end supply chain, and I'll talk about logistics' role in that. The audience for this webinar is lucky to receive this update. This report was recently updated. in the last few weeks, and Kearney launched it more broadly. And we're going to the details in this section in the next 15 minutes. So Lynn, with that, let's move to next page, please. So here's the overview of this study. So the background is that with the World Economic Forum, we have a partnership, and we conduct studies on different aspects of businesses, and it could be ranging from sustainability to resilience, which is a key topic in the last 2 years. And this resilience study is what we conducted last year and refreshed it recently. Last year, it gave us a very interesting insights on how companies are in early stages of resilience and what it means to their respective supply chain plans. And this year, the insights were more about, as we've learned how to be resilient last year, how does that reflect in our thinking in the long term for our overall supply chain strategy? So this is an overview of the participants that we tap into. It's global, it's multidisciplinary across different industries, and well represented by the different regions, which allows us to extract the flavors, the key themes from every industry or every geography, but also understand what are the commonalities and exchange practices across the sea. I wanted to mention that we have another team that actually works on this report, that works with the World Economic Forum. And if anyone, if you're interested in going deeper into it, you can reach out to Michael Zimmerman or myself, and we'd be happy to connect you with that group. On the next page, so this is at the highest level an overview of the outcome of the survey, and what this of the study. What this suggests is that out of the total population of companies that we interviewed and that we studied, roughly 12% are what we would call as leaders, which means they are the ones who are actually better prepared in case there is an event. And that means that they have actually analyzed and they have a better understanding of the weakest link in their supply chains, and they have actively worked to address those weakest links, such that if another event happens, whether it's related to logistics or related to planning, they will be able to react to it, or they'll be able to respond to it actually in a more controllable manner. And being mainstream means that these companies have identified some of the basic resilience principles, but they're not leading the way, and they have an opportunity to kind of jump towards the leading box. And laggards, really, we think, are companies who still view or who have still solved for resilience in a more reactive way, and they're in the lookout for, if there's an event, right? Then what are the options to be considered in order to respond to resilience? The other point I want to mention is what we've also explored in the study further are the two aspects of resilience, which is both the supply side of the equation and the demand side of the equation. On the supply side, and that's where it becomes more mainstream, is where companies are very good in business continuity planning. But if one thing COVID has taught us is where every time there is an event, customers respond differently, and certain products which we would have never thought would be selling significant quantities, they actually sell pretty well. So the demand charts went over the roof, or they completely tanked last year, and that is another I would say form of shock that companies were challenged to respond to, in addition to the supply side of the shock. And that is what true resilience means. It's preparing for both the supply and the demand side. And that's why actually leaders are prepared to do better in this case. So with that, let's move to page number 14. Okay, great. So as I was starting to allude to the supply and demand side dimensions, now let's double click on what is in these dimensions. And this is where you will see logistics plays a key role. And the reason why we're talking about this today is because there are two levels of resilience. There is resilience within your logistics ecosystem or your logistics network itself. And then there is protection or resilience that you need to build in order to respond to, or in order to absorb the shock that happens in other aspects of a supply chain, right? So if there was a failure in the planning aspect, or if there was a failure in the supplier piece of the supply chain. How does that have implications to the way you plan logistics is very important. So we got to look at it from a micro perspective, but also across the supply chain perspective to be able to prepare logistics to be more resilient. That's the reason we're talking about this today. So let's start with the right-hand side, the demand side dimensions. We go deeper into the aspects which influence the demand side of the equation, which is the design of the product, to what extent it's super complex, and in case there was an event which created blockages, or it created hurdles for you to go acquire the product materials that make the product. In that case, you have more exposure if you had a very complex product. So we look at the complexity and the portfolio aspect of the product. We look at the level of diversity and complexity you have from a customer lens perspective. So this is where, if certain parts of the world were hit worse than the others, and demand fluctuations can actually be worse in certain parts of the world than the others, then how do you quickly repivot your supply chain to be able to pay more attention to one part of the world versus the other? So we're looking at the customer orientation, with geography being one example. There are many other factors, demographics and whatnot, which impact the customer orientation. Financial visibility is having a good understanding of the financial health across the end-to-end supply chain. Again, so the focus is not just logistics, but looking at end-to-end supply chain, because you could have one part of your chain very weak, and that might break it up, right? So we try to make sure that the overall chain is strong enough. What are the ways in which you go to market, and the kind of exposure you could have on the demand side for the different channels you explore. Then we also look at the supply side of the equation, which is the more traditional lens, right? Companies look at the logistics system, the strength of your distribution network and the optionality that you have there. The manufacturing network, to what extent you have flexibility, and to what extent has your production network been designed keeping resilience in mind. The supply landscape, this is the most common space to look at, is what is the diversity and what is the degree of multi-sourcing that you're doing today, and new supply development that's happening. And planning, which is the ability to rapidly sense any major changes that would happen both on the demand side and the supply side, and then pivot your supply chain planning capabilities and your forecasting capabilities accordingly. So we go very deep into each of these questions, and as I showed in 2 slides back, roughly those 400 odd companies, they went into each of these sections and think about roughly 40 odd questions across these different 8 dimensions, and we have to understand where the weakest link is, right? And where, if there was a shock in one part of the supply chain, where would you feel the impact? Right? Quite often when an earthquake happens, the epicenter definitely feels the impact, but it happens all, it ripples, and you see the impact over a larger radius. And sometimes it's even worse in certain parts, depending on your infrastructure, where you are. So this is really about feeling where the impact is across the value chain. And it's really important from a logistics practitioner perspective, because quite often not many things are in your control, but you still have to prepare for that shock absorption that may be presented to you because some other functions in supply chain were not well prepared. So on the next page, I'll just show you very quickly the profiles that came out of the survey. So you could be the different archetypes for resilience, and no archetype is wrong. It really depends on on the business, on the industry, the profile that you represent, right? And the criticality of the supply chain function to that business, right? So these profiles could take different shapes, but I think it's just a good way to understand, depending on where you are, the recommendations that you would have to improve resiliency across the dimension supply chain would be different. So this shows you the different types of 5 leader profiles. And what was interesting is that no one leader is the same as the other, meaning that the resiliency that they were able to achieve, because of which they were a leader, one company probably achieved resilience in planning, because that is super critical, because that's where the most variability happens. Another company, probably for them, the weakest link was distribution. and that's where they achieve resiliency. So the profile really differentiates based on the industry in the leaders, and this is a good starting point to think through, depending on where you are, what is the next step and what are the recommendations for you coming out of the insights in the survey. And then I will leave you with just this last one page, and the comment that I remember we shared last time was that never waste a crisis. This time we would like to leave you with a comment that don't exit the crisis, but with a sure footing. So hopefully last year, many logisticians not only prepared for the near term labor shortages and the capacity shortages, but hopefully you all have taken a fundamental look at what it would mean to be resilient within your function, but also how you can work better with your partners and with your other groups in supply chain in order to achieve that resilience that I was just talking about. And there are 4 themes that we have repeatedly talked about last year as well, and even the report this year. But I would say the direction or the acceleration, the degree of adoption has obviously changed for these 4 themes. So the first one is investing in technology and visibility for efficiency. This came out loud and clear in our resilience study, and this is also super loud and clear within the logistics function. We hear a lot about the acceleration towards control towers. What we're seeing is that companies are moving away from just thinking about more logistics control towers, but more end-to-end control towers, end-to-end supply chain control towers. Because quite often when we see control towers, we're thinking about, the Domino's Pizza app kind of visibility for your distribution to the outbound. But then what's happening on the inbound is always a black hole. And I think that's where there's an opportunity for companies who are looking to become more resilient, is to create that end-to-end visibility using the control tower. Leveraging automation is obviously important, and there's been a plethora of robotics and automation startups that have sprouted over the past several years. And we'll get to this in more detail in the Q&A, but I would say that right now, super important to understand where you need the automation and how you can combat the inefficiencies that you're seeing around in terms of reliance on hiring and reliance on people. And then lastly, continue to invest in data and tools, and it's super important, again, to keep that visibility across the supply chain versus looking at it in silos. The next theme is prioritizing risk mitigation and planning for optionality. Again, it's not an option, it's a must-have. And I started off by saying it's not about just in time anymore, it's more about just in case. And we are seeing over the last year, the typical supply chain triangle of cost and working capital and service now has a 4-dimension resiliency. And as you're optimizing your distribution network, or your logistics cost for that matter, or your logistics model for that matter, resilience is a 4th dimension, and maybe sustainability is a 5th dimension actually, which we're now seeing coming in that picture. And it's important to give each of those dimensions equal importance, as opposed to adding them as a layer which comes after you've made the decisions based on cost, working capital, and service. Diversifying the needs for supply chain, again, very important. This is where we talked about this in the report a little bit. It's really around revisiting where you can actually do some of the activities yourself versus where you want to partner. And traditionally, 3PLs is where they pop up over here, right? Is around evaluating core competencies and working with 3PLs to see where they can actually pick up some of the non-core aspects for logistics for you. Last year, it was different though, because most 3PLs were also out of capacity and they were completely maxed out. So it's another opportunity for several companies to step back and reevaluate: is this a space in which you actually want to build a competency in the event that you're not able to get the partnership you're looking for, or turn around and speak with other companies, other non-competitors who may be able to build that shared economy model. And then we talked a lot about resilience. The last piece I will leave you with is, it's not only about working on your supply resilience, it's also looking at the demand resilience. So the circling back with forecasting and planning and getting a better sense of the big changes in demand is extremely important. And and being ready to repivot within your logistics planning function is very critical. So with that, I'll leave the presentation now. Our plan was to spend the first 30 minutes to go through the report, both resilience and the state of logistics, and then leave the remaining 30 minutes for Q&A. I understand some questions were submitted in advance, so I'll turn it over to Lynn to initiate the Q&A, and then we look forward to receiving more in the discussion right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Balika. So now we're transitioning into the Q&A session. Like Balika mentioned, a few questions were submitted prior to the webinar. So we'll be addressing those first and then open the floor to the audience. Again, please submit your questions through the WebEx Q&A feature located at the bottom right of your screen. And be sure to send the questions to all panelists. All questions will remain anonymous. Without further ado, the first question we have is on motor carriers for you, Michael. How can logistics companies mitigate driver shortages? What are some creative solutions companies can leverage? Can rail become competitive in this needed tomorrow market?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good and very relevant question, especially given capacity shortages, driver shortages. My first answer about both logistics companies and I would say internal logistics functions that have fleets is around shipper of choice. And that is a catch-all term for making the shipping function, the logistics function, easier to deal with for carriers and for truckers. And there are four components to that. One is around the carrier relationship management. So whether that's with your own private or dedicated fleet or with your common carriers, it's segmenting your carriers, getting to know them well, which regions they work well in, what kind of equipment they work best with. Is it live load? Is it drop trailer? Where do they get their best backhauls? So knowing your carriers well, as opposed to the historical arm's length relationship, and that sets a context. The second area is around capacity planning and everything really before the truck gets to the site. So capacity planning, adjustments, forecasting of requirements, even the load tendering process and the routing guide cascade, how you operate that, making that more transparent, having more exchanges of information with the carriers is going to make you better at planning for what actually happens when the carrier shows up. The third area is, of course, the carrier experience on the site, both at your site and at the destination. And being hyper aware of what that driver experience is like, when they check in, what is the treatment at the guard shack like, how quickly do they get in and out, how are they treated, are there bathrooms and even showers available for the drivers. These are hyper important because the drivers talk to each other. Go look up your site on Google Maps. We've helped our clients just think about that basic aspect and read what the carriers are saying about you, and then use that information to help your operations understand better where the gaps are in terms of treating them. The fourth area finally is around post-shipment experience. Are your payment terms good? If you're taking more than 30 days to pay your carriers, you need to have a conversation with your CFO and tell them that it's costing your company more than you're saving by pushing payment terms beyond 30 days, because a lot of these carriers are simply factoring their receivables and charging you for it. Claims resolution, communications. So biggest, simplest answer, Lynn, and I'm sorry it was a long answer, is make those carriers' lives easier and better and make yourself more attractive as a shipper. And then after that, work harder to plan better with your customers and your suppliers so that the flows are not as volatile. I'll stop there. Oh, there was rail. I'm sorry. There was a second question about rail. The intermodal part of the industry is working very hard. And as the report observes, they're investing a lot of money in, quote, competing with the highway. So they are investing serious capital in making intermodal a real alternative to the road. And for long haul trucking, it really has come a long way. but there still is a way to go in terms of providing visibility and transparency on where the shipments are, and if there are delays, when are they going to happen. So it's very much a work in progress. It has improved, and we absolutely encourage shippers to be constantly looking at intermodal opportunities and making that trade-off as they seek to expand their optionality in national over-the-road shipping. I'll stop there, Lynn.
Thanks, Michael. The second question is on trends for Balika. What are the most efficient innovations in logistics for e-commerce? What are the most promising innovations for intralogistics?
Thanks, Lynn. I would say that it's efficient, and I mean, maybe it's a two-part question: it's efficient and what's scalable, right? We're seeing a lot of innovations coming out, which are driven by the challenges that consumers are throwing based on how they're buying in the last year. But what is efficient, what's scalable, and what's here to stay is still TBD. So I would say that a few that I have seen, which started before the pandemic, so it's been in the making for a few years. It's really around converting your stores, especially if you are a retailer or you have some presence, which is closer to customers, leveraging your stores in different ways, whether it's using your smaller footprint and converting that into more of a classic four walls for forward deployment and micro fulfillment centers, or using them as just pure dark stores for that matter. But we're seeing a lot of innovations which have gained scale, not an efficiency, over the last few years on that front. Within intralogistics, again, what we have seen in the retail world, this is where I think it's more applicable, is the basket size the basket composition and the size has completely changed. And COVID drove much larger basket sizes and more complex basket sizes, so or compositions. So that creates pressures, or that creates complications for the warehouses that are picking and packing these products. So we're seeing innovations on that front within the four walls, within intralogistics, around arranging the products and using technology and automation for more custom picking of the orders. And taking the pressure away from forward deployment in order to get the order to the customer directly to their houses. So that's what I would say on the efficiency in automation there.
Thank you, Balika. The next question, back to motor carriers for you, Michael. Looking for insights on path to normalcy for reefers. Will it be driven by changes in demand or capacity coming online?
It's going to stay tough for reefers because the trucks and the reefer units are more expensive. They take a while to come online, but the change, if it's going to come, is going to come from supply, because demand is only going to increase. There's going to be no calming of demand, and I know a lot of reefer carrier shippers, and they're generally very good at filling those trucks. So there's not going to be a decline in demand from increased efficiency of the existing capacity. It's going to have to come from more trucks and more drivers. And those are coming, but as we mentioned during the main part of the report, they're not coming in large enough numbers or fast enough. So we anticipate that segment is going to stay pretty constrained, at least through the end of the year. And we know that all of the retailers and the grocers are putting more and more emphasis on fresh, on produce. So again, no let up on the demand side, and the supply side is not going to be catching up anytime soon.
Thank you, Michael. So back to trends for you, Balika. What is Kearney's perspective on increased onshoring to mitigate tariffs?
Yeah, we touched upon this a little bit in the presentation. I would say that the right word is right shoring and not onshoring. And we have a detailed report that comes out around, I think it's May of this year, and maybe we should send a follow-on to all the participants of the webinar. It's called the Kearney Reshoring Index, where we go deeper into our perspectives on this topic. So I would say it's not one perspective. We have multiple perspectives, and they are bespoke to the industry you're in. If you're a telco versus, let's say, an apparel manufacturer who's sourcing cotton from China, the perspectives are very different on onshoring or right shoring. I would say the headline over here is that when the administrations changed a few years back, there was a lot of discussion on reshoring, onshoring, keeping only tariffs in mind. However, over the last 2 years, few more variables have been introduced in that equation, where you're not only optimizing for tariffs, but you're optimizing for resiliency, which I talked a lot about, right? And making sure there's continuity of supply. And then there's obviously the cost aspect. So the perspectives actually now become broader, and they include these other factors. And we are seeing many companies proactively standing up alternate sources of supply, or probably even in insourcing some of the manufacturing at the right place, whether it's onshoring or it's nearshoring. It depends on your particular client situation. But we're seeing many companies going ahead and evaluating that. The industry which is doing that a lot is telco, or it's high tech, especially given the chip shortage that we're seeing globally right now.
Maybe I can build
Lynn,
on that.
We're seeing a lot of
Lynn.
questions on chat, Lynn. So maybe we can just move faster to the already submitted Q&A.
Sounds good. And Michael, you wanted to chime in here?
Well, yes, just adding to Balika's point is that for the logisticians on this call, the increasing trend to seek better optionality, whether it's near shore or offshore or right shore, means that the skills of logisticians, the people on this call, are increasingly in demand. And not only do supply chain leaders and company leaders expect more from supply chain professionals and the logisticians that are running these supply chains, they're looking to you for that kind of optionality. So how are you going to enable multiple sources, whereas previously it might have only been China for a product? Or if something is going to now be manufactured in the States that was manufactured offshore, how are you as the logistician going to enable the inbound material supply that now needs to come with that? So I think that even though this is a painful transition that logisticians are going through, the balance of the news is good because the skill set is very much in demand.
Thanks for your input, Michael. Another question on truck tightness and also wall ports from the audience. Michael, can you please provide your viewpoint about the truck tightness through 2022, and what do you see is happening at the ports?
Yeah, there's not a lot of good news there. Every time the ports, start to catch up and start to report fewer numbers of vessels anchored outside of LA Long Beach or outside of Oakland, something happens. There aren't enough containers going back, or there's a new outbreak of COVID somewhere in the world, or obviously we saw a mega ship get stuck in the Suez Canal. This isn't getting better in the short term. The ports are seeing record volumes, and importers are ordering record volumes and trying to grab every bit of capacity that they can. So unfortunately, the same way someone might schedule a warehouse set of docks for perfection, and then as soon as there's a problem, they cascade and all the trucks are late. It's the same thing in the ports, is that they try to maximize the throughput, but as soon as there's a problem, the delays start cascading. And we do not see that ending before the end of the year. Perhaps if the Fed has to slam on the brakes and there's some economic slowdown, and that coincides with the Chinese New Year, we might see some relief in February. But unless there's a significant economic slowdown that starts to manifest itself in the last few months of this year, we see this tight capacity situation both with the ports and container shortages pushing out well into Q1 of 2022, and then it's anyone's bet what happens after that. Historically, the shipping lines have added capacity and added too much capacity, and the market burst. And if history is a teacher, we should see that happen again. But the question is when, and we don't really see that happening strongly at least until Q2 of 2022.
Thank you, Michael, for the response. Another question on trends and digitalization of logistics for Balika. What are the ways companies can start digitalization of logistics and supply chain, especially within the logistics and supply chain industry?
Well, I would say the move has already happened to become more digital, and the answer depends on whether you are a carrier or a shipper. From a shipper perspective, and that's where I spend most of my time with. Digital supply chain is right now most useful for two purposes: is to help get the visibility that I talked about earlier in the resilience section, and the second is to create a better, lasting customer experience. One of the key takeaways that I've had in working with my clients last year is that cost obviously is part of the key equation that you're constantly optimizing for, but a key differentiator in the last year has been service and your ability to create that lasting consumer experience, especially when consumers are changing the way they interact with companies. So I think providing the role of digital actually has become even more prominent in logistics. And as a provider, if you are able to help shippers become more, increase their visibility with the right control tower kind of capabilities, and help create that lasting consumer experience, whether it's at the time of the delivery of the order or at the time of interaction during returns for that matter, I think all those touch points become very relevant, and that's where digital can play a key role.
Thank you, Balika. Also, a quick response to the question. We will be sending out a summary of this presentation afterwards.
That's great. Lynn, should maybe Michael and I can just take a look at the Q&A and pick a few, because there are a lot flowing over here. So I'm gonna just start. I did see a question on reverse logistics and last mile. I would say that the state of reverse logistics and last mile, it's the most exciting right now. And I'm always very, very positive and excited with the challenge. What I've seen in industries that have a last mile return component, there are two sectors where the behaviors or the challenges are very different. One is where there's a services component involved in addition to the product delivery or the product return, and the other is where it's just a pure transaction, like a consumer goods company or a retailer for consumer goods, like an Amazon or Target for that matter. If you are the latter, what we've seen in the last year and maybe last couple of years, even before the pandemic, is that the emphasis obviously has moved a lot towards the last mile fulfillment, but creating a lot of optionality and essentially providing the customers the ability to transact anywhere and to access the product anywhere. And that is also returning into the return space, where consumers want to have the ability to initiate a return anywhere and to actually physically leave the product anywhere. So we're seeing interesting trends. If you are a consumer goods retailer or an apparel retailer for that matter, we're seeing some interesting trends where companies actually are moving away from the Amazon-like behavior, and they are trying to train the consumers to actually come to the physical store and interact with them, and thereby taking some of the pressure away from last mile. But still, it's an alternative fulfillment model, but moving away from the traditional last mile where you're delivering to the consumer's house. Whereas if you're a company which is, let's say, a telco provider, which has a key services component to it, the interaction with the customer is very important. And the reverse operations become even more complex because that's a revenue generator for telco companies. So there we're seeing more aggregators coming into play, because as you have omni-channel or omni-returns being added, we're seeing the role of an aggregator is becoming even more important, who can absorb these different evolving returns channels and can aggregate it at one point to provide the customer that one consistent experience. So that's what I would say on last mile and reverse logistics. Michael, is there anything on the list that you would like to pick up?
Yeah, I'll take a couple in a row. I see one question: where do you see rental rates for warehousing in 2022 for Inland Empire? The news isn't good there unless you're a real estate developer or a lessor. That's probably one of the tightest markets in the country, maybe tied with New York City, where Amazon bought up all of the capacity in the 5 boroughs during the pandemic. They paid top dollar for that. We saw that when we were talking to some real estate people. But the Inland Empire is one of the most expensive markets in the country. It's hard to build there. And I think most of the spec capacity is spoken through the end of the year and early into 2022. And it takes at a minimum 12 and usually 18 months for a new build in place. So, the warehousing rates are going to stay very high there, and they're probably going to increase. I think the average increase was somewhere around 5 to 6% nationally last year. You would expect the Inland Empire to be north of that number. Maybe even into the double digits. I've heard some clients talk about double-digit increases in the Inland Empire. So no relief there, unfortunately, at least through the middle of 2022, and honestly, probably through the end of the year. And then I saw a question on, where is the extra trucking capacity going to come from? Because obviously, it's the drivers, right? The short-term answer is money. The only way that that industry is going to attract more drivers is to pay them more, and that's already underway with higher salaries and higher signing bonuses. And I would say a very close second to money, and maybe even more important, if I read the comments well, is working conditions, and this brings us back to shipper of choice. So it's not just the shippers improving working conditions for their carriers and working with their customers to improve receiving conditions, but the trucking companies are much wiser to this now, and they're identifying locations that don't treat carriers well, and frankly, they're firing shippers. So more emphasis again on improving conditions for drivers and shipper of choice as part of any network expansion, capacity expansion, or frankly, any logistics sourcing exercise. If you're not doing shipper of choice as part of that, you're on the back foot. All right, Balika, did you find some other questions you want to go after?
I did. I can take a couple moments, and I can do this all day with you, Michael. So the couple more I see over here. So there's a question on parcel, and I'm not going to name providers just to be respectful here, but everyone is seeing challenge, right, from a cost perspective, for especially if you are a large corporation that relies heavily on parcel providers. You should be reevaluating your strategy. And here's what we're recommending companies to do. What the parcel providers have very clearly indicated, right, through the surcharges that they are slapping, quarter after quarter, is that they don't find your shipments any more attractive. Actually, being bigger is not good in this particular market right now. As a shipper who is a user of parcel services, you should be trying to understand how you can change your shipment profile. Going back to the last mile discussion we had, the shipment profile is constantly changing, and what is more attractive to your particular carrier? Maybe last mile is not that attractive, but middle mile ground is actually that attractive. So try to segment it by the services and understand what is most attractive to the carrier, and have an open discussion around that, right? Second is build optionality with regional capacity and with gig economy players. Gone are the days where you would just have one or two of these traditional parcel carriers that would basically move all your shipments to the network. You absolutely need to have optionality, and the regional space is getting disrupted. Some of the smaller providers who are probably not even known names in the last 2-3 years, they're becoming really, really big. And they've made some very, very interesting investments in increasing their coverage in the regional markets, which traditionally is a concern when you talk about the regional markets. So we're seeing a lot of clients tapping into regional capacity. And if you've not done that already, I would actually caution that you're late, because some of the regional carriers are even getting maxed out because many are reaching out to them. And then finally is using gig economy players, using a mix of them, depending again on the shipment profile that I talked about. So you need to change your carrier profile. You need to understand what shipment profile is going to be attractive to the particular segment you're going after. And I would introduce another lever over here, which is around using your own people, repurposing your own workforce. And if you have any assets, or if you have a partnership with another company, leveraging their vans for that matter, I think is very important. So you should expect significant cost increases, and the big parcel carriers have not been shy about that, and they've been very clear about where they're focusing their business on. The other question I'll pick on at this point, and I'll give it to you, Michael. I saw a question on resilience, I think. So with a shift to just in case rather than just in time planning, as well as increasing the warehousing last year, do you see the demand for physical storage space growing faster than what is available? In retail specifically, I know a lot of companies are now sitting on aging merchandise from last year in warehouses, and that will certainly lead to high markdowns, slow turns, and bloated inventory. With that and a rise in e-commerce, I'm interested in if you think that warehousing will become more difficult. Absolutely. It continues to be difficult for especially the retail space. We are seeing companies take a few innovative approaches. Obviously, like, with the aging merchandise and with the constant change in the seasons and the calendars for that matter, we're seeing that, and with the big demand shifts, right? We're seeing companies they're sitting on a lot of merchandise for certain categories, which typically would sell a lot, and for some, which they're kind of out of stock. This is where it goes back to the whole resilience and planning piece. We have an approach which is called a sense and pivot. And we tend to, we've seen that has been successful for companies who start off with a massive cleanup, which you likely have to do at this point if you have loaded inventory, especially in categories which are out of fashion right now, or out of season right now. So you likely will have to do a cleanup, and there could be different ways in which you could do the cleanup in terms of reselling or just auctioning material off for that matter. But once you do that, and if you're resetting inventory levels, using the sense and pivot methodology really helps to get to that shift in just in case, where your planning functions, your merchandising, your vendor management, all of that is linked, and it can well react to any major changes that you anticipate in demand. So it's actually a pretty deep question. We can definitely go deeper into it offline, because this is not only about logistics. It's a lot about some of the other aspects in supply chain. Michael?
Yeah, so I got a question. In your opinion, are the container shortages and blank sailings artificial, like local gasoline prices following some refinery news? I would say that yes, up until the end of 2019, blank sailings were used by carriers to manage and to constrain capacity. There was a deliberate effort to do that. I think that, and then in the beginning of COVID, because demand collapsed, there were also blank sailings, but that wasn't artificial. I think since COVID, there haven't been artificial blank sailings, and the container shortage is very real. And the simple reason for that is because of the tremendous disruption in all of the supply chains that we've been talking about. So previously, efficient ship and container movements and the networks that they were serving were completely disrupted by COVID. We've had a K-shaped recovery where CPG and grocery and retail has done very well, but heavy industry has been heavily disrupted and in some cases stopped and is restarting slowly. That means that the containers are in the wrong places, and that they're going back empty, and they're not going back fast enough. The carriers would love to put more capacity on the market because they will just simply make more money. They're making the best profits they've ever made right now. So I would say that there's nothing artificial about container shortages or blank sailings in the last 6 months, and probably not for the next 6 months. Next year, we'll see if the carriers overshoot and decide to prioritize capacity management over market share. Historically, they haven't, but we've seen that they've gotten much better at being disciplined with capacity. So we could go back to seeing blank sailings as a tool to reduce capacity, as opposed to an unfortunate necessity in the face of volatility. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael and Balika, for a very insightful Q&A session. We have reached the end of our webinar for today due to the limited amount of time we have. So thank you again for joining us for the 2021 Kearney State of Logistics webinar. Please, if you're interested in learning more about the report or start receiving our shippers complex reports right to your inbox, please scan the QR code on the screen to learn more. We're looking forward to hearing from you and help support any logistics need you may have in the future. and let's stay connected with Kearney. Thank you.
Yes, please. And you have if you I know our emails are not here, but then you can always reach out to us on LinkedIn if you wanted to, or my email is my first name dot last name at kearney.com, and I think Michael's is the same. I know there were many questions we did not get to in the chat, but if you have any more that you want to follow up offline, please do reach out.
Yeah,
thank you.
And we'll seek to answer them all and get them out to you. So, and we'll get that to you with the deck. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Bye. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Lynn.
Cheers. Thanks, Balika. Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, everyone.